The day I got my first pair of glasses, I felt like the world had finally clicked into place. My parents had been skeptical at first, insisting that my vision was fine. But after a series of tests, the doctor had prescribed me special glasses. He mentioned something about an anomaly in my vision that was pretty common, yet required a unique solution. He assured my parents it was for my own good. As I slipped the glasses on for the first time, I was amazed at the sharpness of everything around me. Colors seemed more vibrant, and distant objects came into focus. But over the next few days, something else happened, something far more unsettling. It started subtly. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. Shadows in my room seemed to twist and shift, forming shapes that were almost but not quite human. When I walked through darkened parking lots, I felt eyes on me, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw fleeting glimpses of figures that weren't there when I turned to look directly. By the third day, I couldn't deny what I was seeing. Nightmare creatures, grotesque and horrifying, lurked in the periphery of my vision. They clung to the corners of my room, their eyes glowing with malevolent intent. In the park, they hid among the trees, watching me with unblinking stares. Every shadow seemed to conceal a lurking horror. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, a side effect of adjusting to the new lenses. But the creatures were too real, too vivid to dismiss. I felt their presence even when I couldn't see them directly. They whispered in low, guttural tones, speaking a language I couldn't understand but felt deep in my bones. By the end of the week, I was at my wits' end. My nights were sleepless, plagued by the feeling of being watched. My days were filled with a constant sense of dread, knowing that at any moment I might see one of those creatures staring back at me. I had to do something. I couldn't live like this. Today I made a decision. I took off my glasses. The relief was immediate. The world blurred around me, and with it, the creatures faded into indistinct shapes. What had been a monstrous figure in the corner of my room now looked like nothing more than a pile of clothes. The shadows in the parking lot were just that, shadows. But even as I breathed a sigh of relief, I knew the truth. The glasses had shown me a reality that was always there, lurking just out of sight. I wasn't seeing things that weren't there. I was seeing things that everyone else couldn't. The doctor had said I was lucky to get these glasses, that many people never had the chance to see the world this way. But I didn't feel lucky. I felt cursed. I spent the rest of the day in a fog of blurred vision, preferring the indistinct shapes and comforting illusions of my normal eyesight. Ignorance, I realized, truly was bliss. As evening fell, I placed the glasses back in their case and tucked them away in a drawer, out of sight. That night I slept deeply for the first time in days. No whispers haunted my dreams, no glowing eyes pierced the darkness. I woke up feeling refreshed, almost normal. But the memory of those creatures lingered at the edges of my mind, a constant reminder of the truth I had glimpsed. I know now that the world is filled with things we aren't meant to see, things that hide in the shadows and thrive in the darkness. My glasses had given me a window into that hidden world, but it was a view I never wanted to see again. I returned to the optometrist, handing him the glasses and explaining that I couldn't wear them. He looked at me with a mixture of understanding and pity, nodding as he took them back. "For most people," he said gently, "blurry is just fine." And so I returned to my life of comfortable ignorance. The shadows remained shadows. The trees stayed trees. But every now and then, out of the corner of my eye, I catch a glimpse of something more, a flicker of movement in the darkness. And I remind myself that some truths are better left unseen. Alfred was 12 the first time the old man in the well spoke to him. It was a chilly autumn evening, and the full moon cast long, eerie shadows across the family's small farm. Alfred was out playing, his mother's warning about staying close to the house echoing in his mind. But curiosity and the allure of adventure led him to the old well at the edge of their property. The well was an ancient structure, its stone walls covered in moss, and the wooden beams that supported the rope and pulley system were weathered but sturdy. Alfred had always been told the well had run dry before he was born, yet it still held a strange fascination for him. Suddenly, a slow, raspy voice broke the silence.
"Alfred!"
He whirled around, heart pounding, but saw no one. The fields were empty, the barn quiet. Confusion spread across his face as he heard it again, louder and more insistent this time.
"Alfred!"
The voice sounded like one of the old farmers who liked to smoke, thought Alfred. Trembling slightly, he peered down into the well. The darkness seemed impenetrable, even under the full moon's light. Then the voice came again, echoing up from the depths.
"Have you got anything tasty?"
Alfred's pulse quickened.
Who are you? How'd you get down there?
"If you give me something tasty, I'll reward you,"
the voice replied. Alfred reached into his pocket and pulled out a few cookies he had stuffed there before leaving the house. He placed them in the bucket and slowly lowered it into the well, the rope uncoiling steadily until he felt the bucket's weight lift, indicating it had reached the bottom. 20 seconds passed and Alfred felt the weight return. He began to pull the bucket up, each turn of the pulley bringing it closer to the surface. As the bucket emerged, he heard the voice again.
"No nice."
Inside the bucket was a rectangular piece of silver metal, about the size of an army dog tag, completely flat and smooth. Alfred stared at it, astonished.
"Want fresh?"
the voice demanded. Despite his questions, the old man did not respond again. Alfred concocted a story about finding the metal and showed it to his father, who took it to town and confirmed it was an ounce of pure silver. The discovery was a secret he cherished, the beginning of a strange and darkly enticing relationship with the voice in the well. Months passed, and Alfred discovered the old man only appeared on the nights of the full moon. He also learned that only live offerings would be rewarded, but each type of animal only once. By the time he was 16, Alfred had a cigar box nearly full of silver pieces. But as the supply of different animals dwindled, so did the rewards. Then, one full moon night, a local farmhand went missing. That same night, Alfred received gold pieces for the first time. The coincidence did not escape him. When Alfred took over the farm, temp workers began to vanish periodically without explanation. Each disappearance coincided with a new reward from the well. Alfred rationalized his actions, telling himself that the rewards justified the means. Years passed, and the farm thrived under Alfred's management. The well remained a closely guarded secret, the source of his wealth and dark compulsion. The old man in the well had finally found something tasty enough to always reward. One full moon night, Alfred stood by the well, looking down into the darkness. The farm was silent, the night air cool against his skin. He no longer felt fear, only a cold, calculating determination. He lowered the bucket once more, feeling the familiar weight of anticipation in his chest. As the bucket reached the bottom, the raspy voice echoed up to him, filled with a sinister satisfaction.
"More, Alfred. More."
Alfred's heart pounded in response, a mix of dread and eagerness. He pulled the bucket up, the weight of it heavier than before. Inside lay the promised gold, glinting in the moonlight. The voice in the well had become his ally, his dark benefactor. And as he stood there, clutching his rewards, Alfred knew that the well's hunger would never be sated, and neither would his own. The farm prospered, but at a terrible cost. He had become a man of means, but his wealth was built on a foundation of darkness and sacrifice. Each full moon brought new opportunities and new horrors, a legacy of greed and shadow that bound him to the well forever. Nate stood at the entrance of the ominously named Gaping Maw. The cave loomed before him like a monstrous mouth, eager to swallow the unwary. He couldn't help but chuckle at the thought, imagining it as some fairy tale beast. The sign outside, weathered and grimy, read, "Gaping Maw Cave, do not enter." To Nate, it was practically an invitation. He glanced back at Claire, who was lagging behind, clutching a walking stick to steady herself.
Come on, Claire, we're burning daylight here.
He called out, a grin plastered on his face. Claire finally caught up, panting heavily.
Can I have some water?
She asked, clearly winded. As she took a sip, Nate looked into the darkness of the cave. It was pitch black, like an endless void waiting to consume them. Claire handed back the bottle, and Nate felt a strange mix of excitement and apprehension.
Ready?
He asked, his voice echoing slightly. Claire nodded and Nate patted her on the back. Together they stepped into the Gaping Maw. Inside, the cave was even darker than it had seemed from the outside. Nate's flashlight barely cut through the blackness. The rocky terrain was wet and uneven, making each step a cautious endeavor. Despite the forbidding surroundings, there was something almost comforting about the darkness. It felt oddly welcoming to Nate. Claire, however, didn't share his sentiment. She shivered under her jacket, her discomfort palpable.
Cold?
Nate asked, trying to peer at her in the gloom. She didn't answer, just kept moving forward. They walked in silence for a while, the only sounds their footsteps and the occasional drip of water echoing through the cavern. After a few minutes, Claire stopped abruptly.
Why are we doing this?
She asked, her voice tinged with frustration. Nate turned to her, shining the flashlight under his chin for a spooky effect.
Adventure, Claire. This is what you wanted, right? A little bit of nature, some excitement.
She shook her head, clearly not amused.
I wanted a beach, not a dank, creepy cave. I get it. You love splunking. But this isn't my idea of fun. Can we please just leave?
Nate sighed, the echo of his breath magnified by the cavern walls.
Okay, let's head back.
He turned around, pointing the flashlight to guide their way. But as they walked, Nate started to feel uneasy. The cave seemed to be shifting around them.
Claire, do you remember which way we came?
She paused, and Nate could sense her growing panic.
No. I thought you knew.
Panic welled up inside Nate.
All right, let's think. We'll retrace our steps.
They walked for what felt like hours, the cave growing colder and more oppressive with each step. Nate's feet ached, and Claire's breathing grew labored. He felt terrible. This was his fault. Then, something strange happened.
Claire, feel this rock.
Nate said, pressing his hand against the wall. It was warm, unnaturally so. Claire touched it and gasped.
What is this?
They followed the warmth along the wall, Nate's flashlight casting eerie shadows. Suddenly, the ceiling closed in, and Nate hit his head.
Ow, damn it!
He cursed.
Nate, are you okay?
Claire's voice trembled.
I'm fine, but we need to find a way out, and fast.
The space was narrowing, squeezing them like a living thing.
We have to turn around,
Nate said, feeling a growing sense of dread. Again, they walked, the cave becoming a maze of dead ends and false passages. Nate's flashlight flickered, the beam weakening.
Claire, this isn't right.
He muttered.
We're lost.
He let go of Claire's hand, desperately feeling along the walls.
Nate, no!
She cried, but he kept moving. The fear was choking him. Then, he hit another corner.
Claire?
He called, but there was no response. Panic surged within him. In the distance, Nate heard a faint, static-like sound. He pressed his ear to the warm rock. Claire's muffled screams reached him from the other side.
No, no, no.
He whispered, dread filling every fiber of his being. The walls seemed to pulse, closing in on him. He stumbled back, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. The walls pressed against his body tighter and tighter. Nate sank to the ground, tears streaming down his face. His flashlight flickered its last, casting a dying glow on a horrifying sight. In the dim light, Nate saw a hand with nails painted bright red, motionless on the ground.
Claire.
He whispered, the word barely escaping his lips. The cave had taken her. Nate screamed as the darkness enveloped him, the gaping maw sealing its newest victim within its eternal, crushing embrace. In the isolated outpost of Ironwood Keep, where the winds whispered secrets through the tall pines and the mountains loomed like ancient sentinels, I was posted to serve. No sooner had I arrived than my old friend Marcus appeared, grinning broadly, and slapped me on the shoulder with a familiar camaraderie. We talked until the sun dipped below the horizon and the stars sparkled in the cold night sky. As soon as Marcus mentioned her name, I knew he was ensnared. To hear him speak, Carmen was a creature of unparalleled grace and beauty, a jewel amidst the rugged wilderness of Ironwood. She was the captain's sister-in-law, and her presence had all the young officers vying for her attention. Carmen, with her raven hair and enigmatic smile, was the queen of their hearts, her allure heightened by the wild, untamed surroundings. Marcus was hopelessly smitten, oscillating between joy when Carmen favored him and despair when she smiled at another. I watched their courtship with growing unease, sensing something dark beneath her beguiling exterior. Carmen was a siren, and Marcus was dangerously close to the rocks. A month into my stay, a grand ball was organized to celebrate the captain's birthday. Marcus was elated when Carmen agreed to be his partner. The evening began with laughter and music, the room alight with the glow of candles and the shimmer of fine attire. Marcus was on cloud 9, but the festivities were interrupted by a breathless messenger. An enemy raid had been spotted. Carmen clung to Marcus, her fear palpable, begging him not to go. Marcus, ever the gallant, proposed to her on the spot. She accepted with a tearful vow to wait for his return. I doubted her sincerity, but Marcus was blind with love. I was assigned to Marcus's squad, and we set out at dawn. The week was grueling, filled with skirmishes and the harsh elements. We split into 2 groups to cover more ground. I led my men to the rendezvous point without loss, but only half of Marcus's squad arrived. He was not among them, fallen in an ambush. We scoured the area but found no trace of him. With a heavy heart, I led the survivors back to Ironwood. Carmen's reaction to the news was a theatrical display of grief. She collapsed into my arms, sobbing dramatically, but her act only deepened my suspicion. Within a week, her mourning veil was lifted, and she resumed her flirtations as if Marcus had never existed. A month later, a wealthy lieutenant arrived from the east. Carmen set her sights on him, and soon they were engaged, planning an extravagant wedding. The entire outpost was invited, and the ceremony was a dazzling spectacle, the weather perfect and spirits high. The reception was in full swing when a sudden gust of icy wind extinguished the candles, plunging the room into an eerie gloom. The heavy doors creaked open, and a deathly silence fell. A figure stood in the doorway, a soldier, his uniform tattered and stained, his face a ghastly pallor. His eyes burned with an unnatural light, and a deep gash from an axe marred his skull. It was Marcus. The guests were paralyzed with shock as Marcus strode into the room, his gaze fixed on Carmen. He reached out and she, frozen with horror, could not resist. The musicians, as if bewitched, began to play a haunting, otherworldly waltz. Marcus and Carmen danced, her white gown trailing like a shroud. His grip tightened, and as they spun, the color drained from her face. She gasped once, eyes wide with terror, and collapsed lifeless in his arms. Marcus dropped her body, his expression one of sorrowful vengeance. He raised his head and let out a soul-piercing wail before vanishing into the night. The spell broken, chaos erupted. The groom wept beside Carmen, his cries mingling with the panicked murmurs of the guests. I could not bear to stay. With the captain's permission, I led a small team to recover Marcus's body. We found him hidden in a rocky crevice, as preserved in death as he had appeared at the ball. We brought Marcus back and buried him beside Carmen. The lieutenant left Ironwood soon after, and I resigned my commission, unable to endure the memories that haunted the place. Years later, I heard whispers that Carmen's ghost was often seen at dusk, weeping by Marcus's grave. But I never returned to Ironwood Keep to see it for myself. He awoke with a start, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was cloaked in darkness, but he could feel them, huge insect-like creatures looming over his bed. Their silhouettes flickered in the dim moonlight, their mandibles clicking rhythmically. Terror gripped him and he screamed with all his might. The creatures scattered, their chittering fading as they disappeared into the shadows. He lay in bed, drenched in sweat, his eyes wide open and darting around the room. Was it a dream? Hours passed, but sleep eluded him. He remained vigilant, every creak of the house sending shivers down his spine. As dawn broke, he heard a soft tap on his door. He hesitated but then gathered his courage and opened it. To his astonishment, one of the creatures stood there holding a plate filled with a fried breakfast. The creature placed the plate on the floor and retreated, maintaining a respectful distance. He stared at the offering, bewildered but hungry. Tentatively, he picked up the plate and took a bite. The creatures chittered excitedly, their eyes gleaming with a strange, unreadable emotion. This ritual continued for weeks. Every morning, he found a plate of food at his door. At first, he worried they were fattening him up for some nefarious purpose. But when a particularly greasy breakfast left him clutching his chest in agony from heartburn, the menu changed. The next morning, there was fresh fruit instead. The creatures seemed to be learning and adapting to his needs. Their care extended beyond meals. They drew hot, steamy baths for him and even tucked him into bed at night. It was bizarre, almost surreal. He couldn't understand their motives, but they didn't seem to want to harm him. One night, he was jolted awake by the sound of gunshots and screaming. He raced downstairs, heart pounding, and stumbled upon a horrifying scene. A decapitated burglar lay on the floor, his lifeless body being devoured by the insects. He gagged, fighting the urge to vomit. Despite his revulsion, he understood. They were protecting him. With a heavy heart, he disposed of the remains as best he could. He didn't know where the creatures came from or what they wanted, but he couldn't deny that they were keeping him safe. One morning, he found the door to his room barricaded. The creatures wouldn't let him leave. Confused but trusting, he lay back down as they gently ushered him into bed. Hours passed, and a burning pain began to spread through his body. He writhed in agony, feeling as though his insides were being shredded by razor wire. The insects chittered softly, their eyes fixed on him with an unsettling intensity. As the pain intensified, he felt a terrible squirming sensation beneath his skin. A horrifying realization dawned on him. The creatures hadn't been protecting him. They had been nurturing their young, using him as an incubator. The chittering grew louder, more frenzied, as the young insects began to emerge, tearing through his flesh. In his final moments, he understood the true nature of the creatures. They were not benevolent protectors, but monstrous parasites. As darkness consumed him, he let out one last, blood-curdling scream. The room fell silent save for the satisfied chittering of the newly hatched insects, ready to continue the cycle.